Hi, I'm Olivia Parker. 6 months ago, I was just another pre-med student with big dreams and a clear path forward. Today, I'm still a student, but everything else has changed. When I discovered my mother had emptied my college fund, money my late father had specifically set aside for my education, to pay for my brother's extravagant wedding, I thought my future had been stolen from me. Little did I know that a stack of university documents would not only reveal a truth that would shatter our family's foundation, but also set me on a path to reclaiming my self-worth in ways I never imagined. This is the story of betrayal, devastating, secrets, and how I learned that sometimes losing what you thought you were entitled to leads you to something far more valuable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Fairview, Connecticut, I was always the responsible one. The planner, the achiever. My father, Robert Parker, was a cardiothoracic surgeon at Fairview Memorial Hospital. Brilliant, methodical, and unfailingly supportive of my academic pursuits. From the moment I brought home my first perfect science test in 3rd grade, he'd say to anyone who would listen, "Olivia's going to be a doctor. Mark my words, she'll be even better than her old man." I never questioned this path. How could I? Medicine wasn't just a career in our family, it was a legacy. My grandfather had been a family physician in the days when doctors still made house calls. My aunt specialized in pediatric oncology. Even my cousins were scattered throughout various medical fields. At family gatherings, dinner conversations revolved around interesting cases, medical breakthroughs, and the politics of hospital administration. I absorbed it all, developing a vocabulary most children my age couldn't comprehend. My younger brother, Nathan, was different. While I was content spending hours with my nose in biology textbooks, Nathan was charismatic and socially adept. He excelled at making connections, at working a room, at making people feel special. Where I was analytical, he was emotional. Where I was cautious, he was spontaneous. My father would sometimes look at him with a mixture of pride and confusion, as if trying to identify where this extroverted, business-minded child had come from in our family of methodical scientists. "Nathan's going to make a fortune in whatever he does," Dad would say with a chuckle. "He could sell ice to Eskimos. Just hope he uses those powers for good." Our mother, Diane, was the bridge between these different worlds. She'd been a nurse. When she met my father, that's how most of the women in our family entered the medical world, but had stepped back from her career when Nathan was born, with some minor health complications that required extra attention in his early years. By the time those issues resolved, she'd settled into the role of supporting our family's busy lives rather than pursuing her own professional ambitions. My father established college funds for both Nathan and me when we were born. "Education is the best investment," he'd always say. "No one can ever take it away from you." Every birthday and Christmas, he would add to our accounts, showing us the statements as we got older. "This is your future," he'd tell us solemnly. "Treat it with respect." For me, that fund represented not just financial security, but my father's belief in me, tangible proof that he saw my potential and was investing in it. For Nathan, whose academic interests were more variable, it represented freedom to explore different paths until he found his calling. Either way, our futures seemed secure, mapped out with the same precision my father brought to his surgical procedures. And then, during my sophomore year of high school, everything changed. My father came home from work one evening complaining of a headache. By midnight, he was in the emergency room. By morning, he was gone. A brain aneurysm that no one could have predicted or prevented. The ultimate irony, the doctor who had saved countless lives couldn't save his own. The funeral was a blur of white coats and solemn faces. Colleagues spoke of my father's steady hands, his innovative techniques, his mentorship of younger doctors. Friends talked about his dry wit, his loyalty, his competitive tennis game. Through it all, I sat between my mother and brother, feeling strangely disconnected from the proceedings. This wasn't my father they were describing, or at least not all of him. Where were the stories about how he taught me to ride a bike by explaining the physics of balance? Or how he would quiz me on anatomy using the Thanksgiving turkey? In the months that followed, our family dynamics shifted in subtle but significant ways. My mother, never particularly practical about financial matters, now faced managing our family's affairs. She leaned heavily on her brother, my Uncle Greg, who worked in insurance and had always presented himself as financially savvy. "Don't worry about a thing," I overheard him telling her one evening. "Robert left everything in excellent order. The life insurance policy is substantial, the mortgage is covered, and the kids' college funds are untouchable until they're ready for school. You just focus on healing." Those words should have been reassuring, but something in my uncle's tone made me uneasy. Throughout my life, I'd observed the subtle competition between my father and Uncle Greg, the doctor versus the businessman, the one who saved lives versus the one who made money. That undercurrent of rivalry had never affected us children before, but now that my father was gone, I wondered how it might influence Uncle Greg's guidance. Still, life continued. I doubled down on my studies, finding comfort in the structure and certainty of academic achievement. If I couldn't control the chaos of grief, at least I could control my grades, my test scores, my path to becoming the doctor my father had believed I would be. Nathan, meanwhile, seemed to drift, his grades slipping as he spent more time with friends, coming home smelling of cigarettes and sometimes alcohol. "He's just processing his grief differently," my mother would say when I expressed concern. "Not everyone copes by becoming more focused like you do, Olivia. Some people need distraction." By senior year, I had my future mapped out. An undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Johns Hopkins, then medical school, ideally at Harvard or Stanford, followed by a residency in cardiothoracic surgery like my father. My applications were flawless, perfect SAT scores, a 4.0 GPA, relevant volunteer experience at Fairview Memorial, glowing recommendations from teachers and my father's former colleagues. When the acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins arrived, along with a merit scholarship that would cover about 30% of the costs, it felt like the first piece of good news since my father's death. "Dad would be so proud," my mother said, hugging me tightly. "We'll need to schedule a meeting with Uncle Greg to discuss accessing your college fund. The partial scholarship helps, but Johns Hopkins is still expensive." Nathan graduated high school the following year with decidedly average grades, but was accepted to the state university based largely on his charismatic interview and compelling personal essay about losing his father. He declared a business major, surprising no one. "Marketing," he announced at dinner. "I'm going to be the best marketing executive the world has ever seen." I was already finishing my freshman year at Johns Hopkins, thriving in the challenging academic environment and feeling confident that I was honoring my father's memory by excelling in my pre-med courses. When I came home for summer break, however, I noticed some changes that concerned me. Our house, always impeccably maintained during my father's lifetime, showed subtle signs of neglect. Chipped paint on the porch, a broken fence picket that hadn't been fixed, landscaping that had grown slightly wild. More concerning were the shopping bags I kept seeing my mother bring home. Designer clothes, expensive electronics, new furniture we didn't need. "Is everything okay financially?" I asked her one afternoon after she returned with yet another purchase. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, looking slightly offended. "Your father left us very well provided for, and Uncle Greg has made some excellent investments with the insurance money. Don't worry about adult matters." I might have pursued the subject further, but Nathan burst in with news of his own. He had met someone. Her name was Vanessa Winters. And she came from one of Fairview's wealthiest families. Her father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships throughout the Northeast, and her mother was on the board of every major charity in the county. "She's incredible," Nathan gushed. "Smart, beautiful, connected. Her family knows everyone who matters in the business world. This could be huge for my future." Within weeks, Vanessa was a constant presence in our home. She was objectively beautiful, with the kind of polished perfection that comes from a lifetime of privilege, and she clearly adored Nathan. My mother was captivated by her, seemingly starstruck by the Winters family's social standing and wealth. I returned to Johns Hopkins for my sophomore year with a vague uneasiness I couldn't quite identify. Something had shifted in our family dynamic, but I was too focused on my challenging course load to give it much thought. When I called home, conversations increasingly centered around Nathan and Vanessa, their relationship, their social engagements, the Winters family's approval. It was during midterms in October when my mother called with the news: Nathan and Vanessa were engaged. "Isn't it wonderful?" she gushed. "They're planning the wedding for next June right after they graduate. The Winters have offered to host it at their country club, but of course we'll need to contribute our fair share." "Nathan is so happy, Olivia. After everything we've been through, don't we deserve some happiness?" I murmured appropriate congratulations, but something in her tone, a nervous edge beneath the excitement, triggered that same uneasiness I'd felt over the summer. Still, I had organic chemistry and molecular biology exams to focus on. Whatever concerns were forming in the back of my mind would have to wait. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Spring semester of my sophomore year brought the crushing workload I'd expected. Between advanced biochemistry labs, research assistant responsibilities, and volunteering at Johns Hopkins Hospital, I barely had time to think about Nathan's upcoming wedding. When my mother called in February asking if I could come home for a weekend to help with wedding preparations, I reluctantly agreed, arranging to complete my lab work ahead of schedule. The moment I walked through our front door, I sensed something was off. The house felt different. There were new furnishings, expensive artwork I didn't recognize, and a complete renovation of our previously modest kitchen. Granite countertops had replaced laminate. Professional-grade appliances gleamed where our serviceable but basic ones had been. "Mom," I said carefully, "did you remodel the kitchen?" "Do you like it?" she asked, gesturing proudly. Vanessa's mother recommended the designer. The Winters have used him for all their properties. "It's beautiful, but—" I hesitated, unsure how to phrase my concern. "Was this in the budget?" My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Olivia, you've always been so practical, just like your father. But sometimes we need to present a certain image. The Winters are accustomed to a particular lifestyle, and I don't want them thinking we can't provide properly for Nathan." The weekend proceeded with a whirlwind of wedding discussions. The guest list had swelled to over 300 people. The reception would feature a 5-course meal with premium open bar. A renowned string quartet would perform during the ceremony, and a 12-piece band was booked for the reception. Vanessa had selected bridesmaid dresses that cost more than my semester textbooks. "And wait until you see the flowers," my mother exclaimed. "The florist is doing full ceiling installations, cascading arrangements down the staircase at the club, and each table will have a unique centerpiece." I nodded and smiled through these conversations while mentally calculating the astronomical costs. When Sunday arrived, I was almost relieved to return to the rationality of science and medicine. April brought another disturbing phone call. My mother sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Olivia, sweetheart, I'm calling about your summer plans. I know you were planning to come home, but I've been thinking, wouldn't it be better for your career if you stayed at Hopkins and did that research internship your professor mentioned?" "Mom, that internship is unpaid. I was counting on—" Coming home and working at Dr. Wilson's office like last summer, I need that income for expenses next year. That's actually why I'm calling, she continued, her voice dropping slightly. The thing is, with the wedding costs, we're a bit stretched right now. I'm not sure we could help with your spending money this summer. What about my college fund? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Couldn't we use a small portion of that for summer expenses if I need it? There was a pause, too long to be insignificant. Let's talk about that when the wedding is over, she finally said. Right now, there's just so much happening. The conversation left me deeply unsettled. I sent applications to 3 paid research positions that afternoon, securing one within a week, lower pay than Dr. Wilson's office would have offered, but enough to cover my summer living expenses in Baltimore. As June approached, my mother's calls became less frequent and increasingly centered around wedding emergencies. The venue had increased their fee. The caterer needed a larger deposit. Vanessa had changed her mind about the flowers and now wanted imported peonies out of season. 2 days before I was scheduled to fly home for the wedding, my phone rang with a call from the university's financial aid office. Miss Parker, this is Denise Wilson from Student Financial Services. I'm calling because we've received your request to defer your fall tuition payment. But there seems to be some confusion. According to our records, you've never established a payment plan before. I'm sorry, I said, confused. I didn't request any deferment. My tuition is covered by my scholarship and my college fund. That's strange, she replied, typing something into her system. We received the paperwork last week, with what appears to be your signature. It indicates financial hardship and requests a 3-month deferment on your fall semester costs. My heart began racing. I never signed anything like that. And there shouldn't be any hardship. My father established a college fund that should more than cover my remaining costs. I see, she said, her tone shifting to concern. In that case, Ms. Parker, I'd recommend you speak with your family immediately and perhaps contact your financial institution. If someone submitted this paperwork without your knowledge or forged your signature, that's a serious matter. Hung up and immediately called the bank where my father had established our college accounts. After verifying my identity, the representative pulled up the account information. Ms. Parker, the account in question was liquidated approximately 4 months ago. Liquidated? I repeated, my voice barely audible. What does that mean exactly? The account was closed, and all funds were withdrawn via a cashier's check made out to Diane Parker. The withdrawal was authorized with the proper documentation, your birth certificate, your mother's identification, and the death certificate for Robert Parker, the original account holder. The room seemed to spin around me. 4 months ago, February, exactly, when the excessive wedding planning had kicked into high gear. When the kitchen renovation had mysteriously appeared. When my mother had started acting strangely about finances. With shaking hands, I called Uncle Greg. As my father's estate executor and our supposed financial advisor, surely he would have prevented this. Olivia, he answered, sounding startled to hear from me. Isn't your flight tomorrow? Is everything all right? Did you know? I demanded, my voice cracking. Did you know Mom emptied my college fund for Nathan's wedding? The silence that followed told me everything. Olivia, he finally said, his voice unnaturally calm. These are complicated adult matters. Your mother made some difficult decisions for the family's overall benefit. Nathan's connection to the eye. Winter's family represents a significant opportunity that will eventually benefit everyone, including you. My education was supposed to be protected, I said, tears streaming down my face. Dad set that money aside specifically for my medical school. How could she just take it? Your mother is under tremendous pressure right now, Uncle Greggy replied, his tone sharpening. The last thing she needs is you questioning her judgment right before this important family event. I suggest you collect yourself before coming home tomorrow. We can discuss the financial arrangements after the wedding." I hung up without responding, my mind racing. The college fund, nearly $200,000 my father had meticulously saved over years, was gone, spent on Nathan's elaborate wedding to impress his future in-laws. My carefully planned future suddenly had a massive hole in it, and no one seemed to think this was a problem worth addressing until after the celebrations. I booked an emergency appointment with my academic advisor for that afternoon, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. "I understand this is deeply upsetting," Dr. Harlow said after listening to my story, "but it's not academically catastrophic. Your scholarship remains in place, and your excellent academic standing makes you eligible for additional merit-based aid. We can also look at research stipends, teaching assistantships, and emergency loans to cover the immediate gap." Her practical approach gave me something to focus on beyond the betrayal. By the time I boarded my flight the next day, I had a folder of financial aid applications, work-study options, and scholarship opportunities. The path forward would be harder. I'd have to work while maintaining my rigorous academic schedule, but it wasn't impossible. My mother met me at the airport, acting as if nothing had happened. She chatted about wedding details, about how handsome Nathan looked in his final tuxedo fitting, about how impressed the Winters had been with the rehearsal dinner venue. I said nothing about what I'd discovered. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in scientific methodology and logical thinking, had decided that confronting her before the wedding would only create a scene that would change nothing about my financial situation. Better to gather more information, understand the full scope of the betrayal, and then address it when emotions weren't running so high. The next 48 hours passed in a surreal blur. I smiled for photographs, helped Vanessa's 7 bridesmaids with their hair, made sure my mother's makeup was perfect, and delivered a maid of honor speech that made the room laugh and cry in all the right places. Not once did I let on that I knew my future had been sacrificed for the elaborate spectacle unfolding around me. Only Nathan seemed to notice something was off. As we danced together during the reception, he studied my face with unusual seriousness. "You seem different, Liv," he said, using his childhood nickname for me. "Everything okay with school?" I looked at my brother, so handsome in his designer tuxedo, so happy on his perfect day, so completely oblivious to what had been sacrificed to make it happen. Did he know? Had he been complicit in the decision to use my education fund for his wedding? Or was he as much in the dark as I had been? "Just tired from finals," I replied, forcing a smile, "and emotional about my little brother being all grown up and married." He grinned, the moment of perceptiveness passing. "Wait till you meet some of Vanessa's friends from business school. There's this one guy, Alex, who's pre-med at Columbia. I think you'd really hit it off." "Always the matchmaker," I said, deflecting the suggestion. The last thing I needed was a setup with someone from the Winters' privileged circle. As the reception wound down and the newlyweds prepared to leave for their 3-week honeymoon in the Maldives, another expense I now wondered about, I found myself standing alone on the country club terrace, staring out at the meticulously manicured grounds illuminated by twinkling lights. "It was worth every penny, wasn't it?" My mother's voice came from behind me. She joined me at the railing, her expression satisfied as she surveyed the remnants of the lavish celebration. I turned to look at her, really look at her, wondering if I knew this woman at all. Had she always valued appearances over substance? Had she always been willing to sacrifice my future for Nathan's? Or had grief and the sudden responsibility of being a single parent changed her so fundamentally? "I need to get back to Baltimore tomorrow," I said, avoiding her question. "I've taken on a research project that starts Monday morning." "So soon?" She frowned. "I thought we'd have a few days together after all the excitement died down." "Life goes on, Mom," I replied, the words carrying more weight than she could possibly understand. "And I have a future to secure." The morning after Nathan's wedding, I woke before dawn in my childhood bedroom. Sleep had been elusive, my mind racing with calculations and contingency plans. My phone showed 3 new emails from Johns Hopkins Financial Aid Office. They had expedited my applications and needed additional documentation. The immediate problem of next semester's tuition loomed large, but beneath it lay a deeper sense of betrayal that no loan application could address. I dressed quietly and went downstairs to make coffee, surprised to find Uncle Greg already seated at our kitchen table, reviewing documents spread across the expensive new granite countertop. "You're up early," he commented without looking up. "I thought all you young people would be sleeping off the celebration." "I have a flight to catch," I replied, keeping my voice neutral as I filled the coffee maker. "What are you doing here? So early?" "Just helping your mother organize some paperwork. The wedding expenses created quite a paper trail." He gathered the documents quickly, sliding them into a leather portfolio. "Your mother mentioned you're heading back to Baltimore today. Don't you want to spend some time with family now that the wedding stress is over?" I turned to face him directly. "I think we both know why I'm leaving early, Uncle Greg." His expression shifted, the affable facade dropping for a moment. "Olivia, I understand you're upset about the financial adjustments, but try to see the bigger picture. Nathan's connection to the Winters family opens doors that will benefit everyone. Sometimes strategic sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." "Strategic sacrifices?" I repeated, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Is that what we're calling the complete liquidation of my college fund? The money my father specifically set aside for my medical education?" Uncle Greg sighed, standing to pour himself more coffee. "Your father was an idealist. He saw the world in black and white, right and wrong, promises kept or broken. The real world requires more flexibility." "The real world requires honesty," I countered. "Mom didn't discuss this with me or ask for my input. She just took the money, and both of you apparently thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late." "Your mother is doing her best in difficult circumstances," he said, his tone sharpening. "Being a widow at her age, with 2 children to support, alone, these are challenges you can't possibly understand yet." Robert left her with impossible expectations to fulfill. I felt my temper rising, but forced myself to remain calm. Getting angry wouldn't change the situation or help me secure my future. "I'm not interested in blame, Uncle Greg. I just need to understand exactly what happened so I can make informed decisions about my education going forward." Something in my rational approach seemed to catch him off guard. He studied me for a moment, perhaps recognizing more of my father in me than he'd previously acknowledged. "The original plan was to use only part of your college fund," he finally admitted, lowering his voice as if concerned about being overheard. "Just enough to cover the essential wedding costs, with the intention of replacing it before you needed the money for medical school." But things escalated. The Winters kept raising expectations, and your mother was determined not to appear inferior to them. "And you advised her through all this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I tried to be a voice of reason," he claimed, though his eyes shifted away from mine. "But your mother was convinced this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the family. Nathan's future father-in-law has connections throughout the business world. The potential benefits seem to outweigh the temporary financial strain." "Temporary? For who?" I asked quietly. "My education isn't a luxury item that can be postponed for a more convenient time." Before he could respond, I heard my mother's footsteps on the stairs. Uncle Greg gave me a warning look, silently asking me not to continue this conversation in her presence. I nodded slightly, not out of deference to his wishes, but because I needed more information before confronting my mother properly. The awkward breakfast that followed was filled with wedding recaps, commentary on various guests, and speculation about the gifts still to be opened when Nathan and Vanessa returned from their honeymoon. Not once did my mother mention finances or my education. As soon as politely possible, I excused myself to finish packing. While gathering my things, I noticed the door to my father's home office was ajar. The room had remained largely untouched since his death, preserved like a museum exhibit to his methodical nature. On impulse, I slipped inside, drawn to the space where my father had often worked late into the night, reviewing patient files or researching surgical techniques. The desk was mostly cleared now, but the built-in filing cabinets remained. I knew my mother rarely entered this room. Too many painful memories, she'd claimed. On a hunch, I tried the cabinet that had always contained our family's important documents. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. Inside, I found a series of folders meticulously labeled in my father's precise handwriting: insurance, house deed, medical directives, children's education. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the last folder and opened it. What I found inside both confirmed my suspicions and complicated them tremendously. There was indeed documentation of my college fund, the account statements, the contribution records, the growth projections. But there was something else I hadn't expected. A separate document, notarized and dated just 2 months before my father's death, establishing a trust specifically for my medical school education. This wasn't the account that had been liquidated for Nathan's wedding. This was an entirely different fund that I hadn't known existed. According to the paperwork, this trust was to remain untouched until I was accepted to medical school, at which point the funds would be released directly to the institution, not to me or my mother. The trustee named was not Uncle Greg, as I might have expected, but my father's colleague and best friend, Dr. William Chen, chief of cardiology at Fairview Memorial. My heart raced as I carefully photographed every page of the document with my phone, then returned everything exactly as I'd found it. I had just closed the drawer when my mother appeared in the doorway. "Olivia, what are you doing in here?" Her voice held more alarm than the situation warranted. "Just saying goodbye," I said, gesturing around the room. "I always feel closest to Dad in here." Her expression softened slightly, though the tension didn't leave her shoulders. "Your Uber will be here in 20 minutes. Are you all packed?" I nodded, following her out of the office. We spent those 20 minutes in stilted small talk, neither of us acknowledging the elephant in the room. When the car arrived, my mother hugged me tightly. "I know you're upset," she whispered, "but someday you'll understand that family has to come first." I pulled back to look her in the eyes. "Dad was family too, Mom, and he had very specific wishes for my education." Before she could respond, I picked up my suitcase and walked out, leaving her standing in the doorway of our increasingly unfamiliar home. On the flight back to Baltimore, I reviewed the photos I'd taken of the trust documents. The language was complex, full of legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but the intent was clear. My father had created a safety net specifically for my medical education, separate from the college fund my mother had liquidated. The question now was whether this trust remained intact and how I could access it. As soon as I landed, I called Dr. Chen's office and left an urgent message with his secretary. To my surprise, he called back within the hour. "Olivia," he said warmly when I answered, "it's wonderful to hear from you. How are your studies progressing?" "They were going well," I replied, deciding to be direct. "But I've just discovered that my mother emptied my college fund to pay for Nathan's wedding." I found documents in Dad's office indicating there might be a separate trust for medical school with you as the trustee. I need to know if that's still intact. There was a long pause. When Dr. Chen spoke again, his voice had lost its warmth. "I was afraid something like this might happen. Your Uncle Greg contacted me several months ago, asking about the trust and whether it could be accessed early for family financial planning purposes. I informed him that the terms were very specific and could not be altered. So it still exists?" I asked, hope rising. "Absolutely," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Your father was quite insistent about protecting your medical education. The trust is structured to remain untouchable until you're accepted to medical school, at which point payments go directly to the institution. Neither your mother nor anyone else can access those funds for any other purpose. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a new concern. Does my mother know about this trust? I believe she was present when Robert established it, Dr. Chen said carefully. But whether she remembers or fully understood the terms, that I can't say. Thank you for protecting it, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Dad would be grateful. Your father was my best friend, he replied, simply. Honoring his wishes is the least I can do. But Olivia, there's something else you should know. The trust is substantial, enough to cover medical school tuition and reasonable living expenses, but it doesn't help with your current undergraduate costs. That was supposed to be covered by the other account. I understand, I said, my mind already shifting back to the immediate problem of next semester's tuition. I'm working on alternative funding options for my undergraduate degree. If I may, Dr. Chen offered, I sit on the scholarship committee for the Connecticut Medical Association. They offer grants to promising pre-med students from our state. The application deadline for this cycle has passed, but given the circumstances, I might be able to arrange an exception. It wouldn't cover everything, but it could help bridge the gap. By the time we ended the call, Dr. Chen had promised to email me the application materials and personally advocate for my case. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start. And more importantly, it was confirmation that my father's legacy hadn't been entirely dismissed in favor of Nathan's social advancement. Back in my small apartment near campus, I created a spreadsheet outlining my financial situation, the scholarship I already had, potential additional aid I was applying for, work-study options, and the possible CMA grant Dr. Chen had mentioned. Even with all these sources combined, I was looking at taking on significant debt to complete my undergraduate degree, something my father had specifically wanted to prevent. As I stared at the numbers, a strange calm settled over me. The path forward would be harder than I'd anticipated, but not impossible. More importantly, I had discovered something crucial about myself in the past 72 hours. I was my father's daughter, not just in my academic abilities and career aspirations, but in my resilience and determination. The foundation he had, built, both financial and character, was stronger than my mother's betrayal. I opened my laptop and began working on the applications that would secure my immediate future, while a plan to address the larger family deception began forming in my mind. The summer that followed Nathan's wedding was transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated. While my former classmates posted pictures of family vacations and internship celebrations, I worked 2 jobs, research assistant in Dr. Kessler's biochemistry lab during the day, and evening receptionist at an urgent care clinic 3 nights a week. Between shifts, I applied for every scholarship, grant, and financial aid opportunity I could find. My apartment lease had ended in May, so I'd moved into a shared house with 5 other students far from campus, significantly reducing my living expenses but adding a 90-minute bus commute to my already packed days. I ate ramen noodles more often than I care to admit and became an expert at finding free events that provided complimentary food. Every dollar I saved went into an account, labeled tuition freedom. Many would have viewed these circumstances as hardship. Strangely, I found them clarifying. Without the safety net my father had so carefully constructed, and my mother had so casually dismantled, I was forced to rely entirely on my own resources, intelligence, work ethic, and determination. Each small victory, from receiving a $500 textbook scholarship to negotiating a $1 per hour raise at the clinic, reinforced my growing sense of self-sufficiency. Communication with my family during this period was minimal. Nathan and Vanessa sent occasional postcards from their extended honeymoon, which had somehow stretched from 3 weeks to 2 months as they island-hopped through the South Pacific. My mother called weekly, but our conversations remained superficial. I responded to her questions about my summer research, but never mentioned my second job or housing situation. She spoke enthusiastically about renovating our guest bathroom and joining the country club where Nathan's wedding had been held, but never referenced the financial decisions that had altered my educational path. In July, I received a letter that changed everything. The university's financial aid office had approved my hardship application, offering a combination of additional merit scholarship and work study that would cover approximately 60% of my remaining tuition. Combined with the Connecticut Medical Association grant Dr. Chen had helped secure and my summer savings, I could now afford to return for fall semester without taking on excessive debt. The letter included a standard paragraph about the university's commitment to ensuring that qualified students could complete their education regardless of financial circumstances. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that caught my attention. Ms. Parker, your situation prompted a review of your file. The documentation you submitted raises concerns about potential financial impropriety. Please contact Dean Morrison's office to discuss this matter confidentially. I stared at the note for a long time, trying to understand its implications. The only documentation I had submitted was the paperwork showing that my college fund had been liquidated without my knowledge or consent, along with bank statements confirming that I no longer had family financial support. What had they found? That warranted a meeting with the dean of students? 2 days later, I sat in Dean Morrison's tastefully appointed office, trying to project calm professionalism despite my racing heart. The dean was a small woman with penetrating eyes and a reputation for both fairness and tenacity. Ms. Parker, she began after we exchanged pleasantries, I want to assure you that this conversation is completely confidential. Nothing we discuss will affect your academic standing or the financial aid package you've been awarded. I appreciate that, I replied, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. But I'm not sure I understand why I'm here. Dean Morrison opened a folder on her desk. When our financial aid office processes applications like yours, where there's been an unexpected change in family financial support, we have certain protocols to follow. One of those involves verifying the information provided to ensure we're allocating resources appropriately. She paused, studying my face. In reviewing your original application to Johns Hopkins, we found something unusual. Your FAFSA from freshman year included information about 2 separate education funds established by your father. One was the general college fund that you've informed us was liquidated. The other was a medical school trust. Yes, I confirmed. I only recently discovered the medical school trust myself. It's structured to become available once I'm accepted to medical school, with payments going directly to the institution. That's our understanding as well. The dean nodded. What concerns us is a discrepancy in subsequent paperwork. Last September, we received an amended financial information form indicating that the medical school trust had been dissolved due to, quote, family financial restructuring following the death of the primary provider. This form appears to have your signature. My blood ran cold. I never signed any such form. She turned the document toward me. There, at the bottom, was what appeared to be my signature, close enough to pass casual inspection, but with subtle differences I could immediately identify. This isn't my signature, I said firmly. And the information is false. The medical school trust still exists. I've confirmed this with the trustee, Dr. William Chen, at Fairview Memorial Hospital. Dean Morrison's expression remained neutral, but I noticed her making a note in the margin of her papers. We suspected as much. The form was submitted electronically, and the IP address traces back to Fairview, Connecticut, not Baltimore, where you were attending classes at the time. My mother, I whispered, the pieces falling into place. Or possibly my uncle. They must have attempted to access the medical school trust after emptying the college fund. Ms. Parker, the dean said, gently, what you're describing potentially constitutes identity theft and attempted fraud. These are serious allegations. The weight of her words settled over me. My mother, or someone acting on her behalf, had not only taken the money my father had set aside for my undergraduate education, but had attempted to access the protected medical school trust by forging my signature. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. "I understand the seriousness," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I'm not sure what the university expects me to do with this information." "We're not expecting you to do anything," Dean Morrison clarified. "The university has already flagged your accounts with additional security measures to prevent any further unauthorized changes. We've also made note that all future financial discussions must take place directly with you, in person, with appropriate identification verification." She closed the folder and leaned forward slightly. "What you do with this information in terms of your family relationships is entirely your decision. I simply felt you had the right to know what we discovered." "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciative of her directness. "May I ask how the university identified that the signature was forged? Most people wouldn't notice the differences." Dean Morrison's expression softened slightly. "It wasn't the signature itself that raised red flags, though our financial aid officers are trained to watch for inconsistencies. It was the fact that the form came from Connecticut while you were documented as being on campus that day. You swiped into the science library at 7:43 a.m. and didn't leave until after midnight, according to the system logs. Unless you've mastered by location, you couldn't have submitted that form from your hometown." I felt a small, unexpected laugh escape me. "The science library. My father always said the truth would find me in libraries and laboratories." The dean smiled. "Your professors speak very highly of your work ethic, Ms. Parker. Dr. Kessler mentioned you're often the first to arrive and last to leave the research lab. That kind of dedication doesn't go unnoticed." As I left her office, I felt strangely unburdened despite the disturbing revelation. The truth, however painful, provided clarity. My mother's actions weren't just impulsive decisions made under wedding pressure. They were part of a calculated attempt to redirect all of my father's carefully planned educational provisions toward other purposes. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Confronting my mother directly seemed unlikely to yield honest answers, given her previous deceptions. Legal action felt extreme. She was still my mother, despite her betrayal. But allowing the situation to continue unchallenged seemed impossible as well. That evening, I called Dr. Chen again, this time sharing everything I had learned from Dean Morrison. "I wish I could say I'm surprised," he sighed after listening to my account. "Your Uncle Greg came to see me in person after I refused his phone request to access the trust. He suggested that you had changed your educational plans and wanted the funds redirected to other family needs. When I explained that would require your notarized consent directly to me as trustee, he became quite insistent that I was being unnecessarily rigid about Robert's outdated wishes." "What did you tell him?" I asked. I reminded him that I had performed his bypass surgery 3 years ago and suggested that his heart might not appreciate the elevated blood pressure he was experiencing during our conversation. Dr. Chen's dry delivery made me smile despite the serious subject. After that, he left rather quickly. I haven't heard from him or your mother since. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "Part of me wants to confront them directly. Another part wants to pretend I never discovered any of this and just focus on my education." "What would your father advise?" Dr. Chen asked after a thoughtful pause. The question hit me with unexpected force. What would my father, methodical, principled, but deeply compassionate, recommend in this situation? "He'd say that truth matters," I replied slowly, "but that how we use truth matters even more. He'd want me to protect what he tried to provide for my future, but he wouldn't want me to destroy my relationship with my family in the process." "That sounds like Robert," Dr. Chen agreed. "He was never one for dramatic confrontations, but he was absolutely unwavering on matters of principle." By the time our call ended, I had the outline of a plan, one that would protect my educational future while offering my mother a chance to explain her actions and potentially make amends. It wasn't the scorched earth approach some might have advocated, nor was it passive acceptance of wrongdoing. It was, I hoped, a path my father would have approved. The next morning, I sent an email to my mother. "Mom, we need to have an important conversation about my educational funding and some concerning documents I've recently become aware of. I'll be coming home next weekend. Please make sure Uncle Greg is available as well, as this involves financial decisions he helped facilitate. This is not a confrontation, but a necessary family discussion about honoring Dad's wishes for all of our futures. I'm approaching this with an open mind and hope you will too. Love, Olivia." Her response came within the hour, brief, somewhat evasive, but not outright refusing the meeting. "Darling, next weekend is difficult. The country club has their summer gala, and I've already committed to the planning committee. Perhaps when Nathan and Vanessa return? They're extending their trip through August now. The Winters insisted on adding a final stop in Bali." I replied immediately, "This can't wait for Nathan's return. I'll arrive Saturday morning at 10 a.m. The conversation won't take long, but it needs to happen before fall semester begins. The country club committee will understand if you need an hour for an important family matter." Then I booked my train ticket, prepared the documentation I would need, and steeled myself for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my young life. The burden of truth was heavy, but I was discovering that the weight of unaddressed deception was far heavier. The train ride to Fairview the following weekend gave me ample time to organize both my thoughts and my evidence. In my messenger bag, I carried a folder containing copies of all the relevant documents: the original trust paperwork from my father's files, the forged financial amendment form from the university, bank statements showing the liquidation of my college fund, and a detailed accounting of the financial aid package I had secured through my own efforts. I had also drafted a proposed resolution, a document outlining how we might move forward as a family while protecting what remained of my father's educational provisions. August in Connecticut brought oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick and immovable. As the taxi turned onto our street, I noticed several landscaping trucks parked along the curb. Workers were installing an elaborate stone water feature in our front yard, another expensive addition that seemed to prioritize appearances over substance. My mother opened the door before I could ring the bell, her expression a complicated mixture of affection and apprehension. She was dressed for her country club meeting in a cream linen suit that probably cost more than my semester's groceries, but her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tension around her eyes. "Olivia, darling," she said, embracing me briefly. "You look tired. Have you been getting enough sleep? You know how you get when you're overtired, just like your father, too focused to take care of yourself properly." "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, stepping past her into the foyer. The interior of our home had changed even more since my last visit. New artwork adorned the walls, the living room furniture had been replaced with more stylish pieces, and what appeared to be an expensive crystal chandelier now hung where our simple dining room light had been. "Is Uncle Greg here?" "He'll be joining us shortly," she said, leading me toward the kitchen. "He had some business to attend to this morning but promised to be here by 11. Can I get you some coffee? I've just made a fresh pot." The kitchen, at least, was familiar territory despite its recent renovation. I set my bag on the counter and accepted the offered coffee, watching as my mother moved with deliberate casualness, filling in the silence with questions about Baltimore's weather and comments about neighbors I barely remembered. Her nervous energy was palpable. "Mom," I said finally, interrupting her monologue about the Hendersons' divorce, "we need to talk about something important, and I'd prefer not to wait for Uncle Greg." She stilled, her coffee cup hovering halfway to her lips. "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" I removed the folder from my bag and placed it on the counter between us. "I know what happened to my college fund. I also know about the attempt to access the medical school trust using a forged signature. The color drained from my mother's face. She set her cup down carefully, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter more than just porcelain. Olivia, these are complicated financial matters that— They're not complicated at all, I interrupted, keeping my voice level. Dad set aside money specifically for my education. You took that money without discussing it with me and spent it on Nathan's wedding. When that wasn't enough, someone, either you or Uncle Greg, forged my signature trying to access the protected trust fund as well. That's not how it happened, she protested weakly. Then tell me how it happened, I said, opening the folder to reveal the bank statements. Explain to me why the account containing nearly $200,000 for my education was emptied in February without my knowledge or consent. My mother's eyes darted toward the front door as if hoping Uncle Greg would arrive to rescue her from this conversation. When no rescue appeared, she sighed and seemed to deflate slightly. It was supposed to be temporary, she began, her voice small. Just a short-term loan to cover the immediate wedding expenses. The Winters kept adding requirements. The venue. Deposit doubled. Vanessa changed her mind about the flowers 3 times. The guest list kept expanding. Greg said we could replace the money before you needed it for tuition. And the forged document? I pressed, sliding the university form across the counter. Was that supposed to be temporary too? She glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. That was Greg's idea. He said we needed a contingency plan in case the wedding expenses couldn't be recouped quickly enough. He assured me it was just a precaution, that we probably wouldn't need to touch your medical school money. So you let him forge my signature? I asked, struggling to keep the incredulity from my voice. I didn't know he was going to do that, she insisted, a hint of defensiveness entering her tone. I thought he was just inquiring about the terms of the trust. When Dr. Chen refused to discuss it without your involvement, Greg said he'd handle the paperwork. I didn't ask for details. Convenient ignorance. It was a pattern I was beginning to recognize in my mother's approach to difficult situations. Avoid asking questions that might yield uncomfortable answers, focus on surface appearances, and leave the messy details to others. Mom, I had to scramble to secure funding for this year, I said, my calm facade beginning to crack. I'm working 2 jobs. I've moved into a house with 5 roommates to save on rent. I applied for every scholarship and grant I could find. All because you decided Nathan's wedding was more important than my education. That's not fair, she protested. Nathan's connection to the Winters family is important for all our futures. Do you know how many doors this marriage opens for him? For us? That's not what Dad wanted, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion building within me. He didn't work 80-hour weeks and carefully save money so that Nathan could have a lavish wedding to impress wealthy in-laws. He wanted us both to have educational opportunities without financial stress. The sound of the front door opening interrupted our conversation. Uncle Greg's voice called out from the foyer. Diane, are you ready for the club meeting? We should leave soon if we want to get good seats for the planning session. My mother called back with forced brightness. In the kitchen, Greg. Olivia's here for a visit. Uncle Greg appeared in the doorway, his initial smile faltering when he saw the documents spread across the counter and the tension evident in our postures. He recovered quickly, extending his hand as if this were a normal family gathering. Olivia, what a nice surprise. Your mother didn't mention you were coming home this weekend. I told her I was coming, I replied, ignoring his outstretched hand. I specifically asked her to make sure you would be here for an important discussion about my educational funding. His expression hardened slightly as he glanced between me and the paperwork on the counter. Ah, I see we're having that conversation now. We are, I confirmed. Mom was just explaining how my college fund was borrowed for Nathan's wedding, expenses, and how you attempted to access my medical school trust by forging my signature on university documents. Uncle Greg's response was more calculated than my mother's had been. Instead of denial, He shifted immediately to justification. The financial decisions made were in the best interest of the family as a whole. Your brother's marriage to Vanessa, Winters represents a significant opportunity that will ultimately benefit everyone, including you. That wasn't your decision to make, I countered. The money Dad set aside for my education wasn't a family slush fund to be redirected whenever something more appealing came along. Your father was an idealist, Uncle Greg said dismissively, echoing his earlier comment. He didn't understand the importance of strategic alliances or social positioning. The medical community operated on different principles than the business world. My father understood values and priorities, I replied, struggling to maintain my composure. He valued education and honoring commitments. He prioritized his children's futures over appearances. And look where that got him, Uncle Greg muttered, immediately seeming to regret the words as they left his mouth. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. My mother looked stricken, her gaze fixed on the granite countertop. I felt a cold clarity settling over me as I finally understood the fundamental disconnect between my perspective and theirs. That's the real issue, isn't it? I said quietly. You never respected my father's choices or values. You saw his dedication to medicine as some kind of naivete rather than the principled commitment it was. And now that he's gone, you feel justified in dismantling the future he tried to secure for me. That's not true, my mother protested weakly. I loved your father. I respected him enormously. But you didn't respect his wishes, I pointed out. The moment he was gone, you started making choices he would have strongly opposed. Choices that prioritized appearances over substance, social advancement over educational opportunity, Nathan's wants over my needs. Uncle Greg's expression darkened. You're being dramatic and selfish, Olivia. This attitude is exactly why we didn't discuss these financial adjustments with you in advance. We knew you wouldn't see the bigger picture. The bigger picture? I repeated, incredulous. Let me tell you what the bigger picture looks like from where I'm standing. It looks like my mother and uncle conspiring to redirect funds specifically designated for my education. It looks like identity theft and attempted fraud when those funds weren't enough. It looks like betrayal, not just of me, but of everything my father valued and worked for. I pulled the final document from my folder, the resolution I had drafted on the train, and placed it on the counter. Here's what's going to happen now. I've secured enough funding through scholarships, grants, and part-time work to complete my undergraduate degree without the money that was taken. I won't pursue legal action regarding the forged documents, provided the medical school trust remains completely untouched moving forward. My mother looked relieved, but Uncle Greg's eyes narrowed suspiciously. And when Nathan returns from his honeymoon, we're going to have a family meeting where you both explain exactly what happened, I continued. He deserves to know that his wedding was funded by sacrificing my education, especially since he'll likely benefit from connections to Dr. Chen and other hospital board members when he launches his marketing career. That's unnecessary, my mother interjected quickly. Nathan doesn't need to be burdened with these financial details. Transparency isn't a burden, Mom. It's respect. I gathered the documents back into my folder, leaving only the resolution on the counter. I've outlined everything in this document, including a repayment plan that would restore at least part of my college fund over the next 5 years. I don't expect to see that money myself, but I'd like it to go toward establishing a scholarship at Dad's hospital for young people pursuing medical careers. Uncle Greg picked up the document, skimming it with a skeptical expression. And if we don't agree to these terms? I met his gaze steadily. Then I'll schedule meetings with the hospital board, the Connecticut Medical Association, and the university's legal department to discuss the forged documents and misappropriated funds. I'm giving you the opportunity to address this privately, as a family, out of respect for Dad's memory and concern for Mom's reputation. But make no mistake, I will protect what remains of my father's legacy, with or without your cooperation." My mother began to cry softly, her carefully applied makeup creating dark streaks down her cheeks. "Olivia, please. I never meant to hurt you. I just got caught up in everything. The wedding planning, the winter's expectations, trying to make Nathan's special day perfect." "I know, Mom," I said, my voice gentling slightly. "That's why I'm not pursuing legal options immediately. I believe you didn't fully understand what Uncle Greg was doing with the forged documents, and I think you genuinely believed the college fund could somehow be replenished before I needed it." I turned back to Uncle Greg, my expression hardening. Again. "But I also believe you took advantage of Mom's grief and financial inexperience to redirect funds in ways that directly contradicted my father's explicit wishes. You prioritized your values over his, your judgment over his careful planning." Uncle Greg set the document down, his expression unreadable. "You're more like your father than I realized," he said finally. "Just as stubborn, just as unwilling to see practical realities." "Thank you," I replied, recognizing the comparison wasn't intended as a compliment, but receiving it as one nonetheless. I'll take that as the highest praise possible. As I gathered my things to leave, my mother reached for my arm. "Please, stay for lunch at least. We can talk more about this. Find a compromise." "I have a train to catch," I said, gently removing her hand. "I start my hospital volunteer shift at 7 a.m. tomorrow, and I have a research paper to finish tonight. My education doesn't pause for family drama." At the door, I turned back one final time. "I expect to hear from both of you within a week regarding the resolution. If Nathan calls before then, I won't volunteer the information, but I won't lie if he asks direct questions either." The walk back to the train station gave me time to process the confrontation. I had entered my childhood home feeling betrayed and diminished. I left feeling strangely empowered. By naming the deception and offering a structured path forward, I had reclaimed not just my father's legacy, but my own agency in determining how that legacy would shape my future. The financial loss still stung, and the fractured trust within my family would take time to repair, if it could be repaired at all. But I had faced the truth head-on and advocated for both my interests and my father's values without burning bridges entirely. It was, I thought as I boarded the train back to Baltimore, exactly the kind of measured yet principled approach my father would have taken. The burden of truth had been heavy to carry, but the clarity it provided was worth the wait. 3 days after my confrontation with my mother and Uncle Greg, I received a text message that caught me completely off guard. It was from Nathan, supposedly still enjoying his extended honeymoon in Bali. "Hey, Liv, can we talk?" Like actually talk, not text? It's important. I stared at my phone, wondering if my mother had already broken down and told him about our conversation. Curious and slightly wary, I texted back suggesting a time that evening after my lab work was complete. To my surprise, he called precisely at the agreed time. "Nathan, I thought you were still in Bali. Isn't it the middle of the night there?" "I'm not in Bali," he replied, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "I'm at the Hartford airport. Just landed. Vanessa's still in Bali with her parents. They flew out last week to join us." "You're back in Connecticut? Why? Is everything okay?" There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "Not really. I need to see you, Liv. Can you come home this weekend?" "I was just there," I said cautiously. "And I have work commitments here. What's going on, Nathan?" "Mom called Vanessa's father," he said, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard in the airport terminal. She was pretty upset, talking about family conflicts and legal threats. Mr. Winters is very protective of family reputation. It's a big thing with them. He started asking questions about our wedding finances that I couldn't answer. My stomach tightened. This was not how I had wanted Nathan to learn about the situation. What kind of questions? Specific ones, about where the money came from. For the venue deposit, the honeymoon package, the rehearsal dinner. Things I assumed Mom and Uncle Greg had handled. He paused again, and when he continued, his voice had a vulnerable quality I hadn't heard since we were children. Liv, did something happen to Dad's life insurance money? Are we in some kind of financial trouble? I closed my eyes, processing this unexpected development. Nathan deserved the truth, but hearing it in an airport after being blindsided by his father-in-law wasn't the right way. It's complicated, I said carefully, but not in the catastrophic way Mom might have made it sound. Where are you staying tonight? I was going to Uber to the house, but now I'm not sure that's a good idea. Something's off, and I want to understand what's happening before I talk to Mom. I made a quick decision. Get a hotel room tonight. Text me the details. I'll take the early train tomorrow and meet you there. We can talk properly and I'll explain everything I know. You're sure? Don't you have classes or something? It's Friday tomorrow. I only have one morning lab and I can make arrangements. This is important, Nathan. After we disconnected, I immediately contacted Dr. Kessler to request a personal day from the lab, promising to make up the hours over the weekend. Then I booked the 6 a.m. train to Hartford and packed an overnight bag, my mind racing with how to approach this conversation with my brother. I had expected to be the one initiating difficult family discussions, not responding to them. But perhaps this was better, Nathan reaching out of his own accord, already sensing that something wasn't right, rather than me forcing uncomfortable revelations upon him. The next morning found me in a modest hotel room near the Hartford airport, watching my brother pace back and forth between the beds. Nathan had always been the more animated of us, physically expressing emotions that I tended to process internally. Now his agitation was palpable as he described the conversation that had precipitated his sudden return. We were having dinner with the Winters at this gorgeous villa overlooking the ocean. Everything was perfect until Mr. Winters received a call. He stepped away, came back looking concerned, and suddenly started asking me about our wedding finances. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood. He said Mom had called Vanessa's mother in tears, talking about family conflicts and potential legal issues. Said it sounded like there might be irregularities with how our wedding was funded. What did you tell him? I asked. The truth, that I didn't know the details. Mom and Uncle Greg handled everything. He stopped pacing to look at me directly. But that's not really true, is it? There's something you know that I don't. I took a deep breath and patted the edge of the bed beside. Sit down, Nathan. This is going to take a while. Over the next hour, I methodically explained everything. The liquidation of my college fund, the attempted access of the medical school trust, the forged documents, and my recent confrontation. I showed him copies of the bank statements and university forms, walking him through the timeline as dispassionately as I could, trying to present facts rather than emotions. Nathan's expressions cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a devastated understanding. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence for several long moments. I had no idea, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Liv, you have to believe me. I never would have allowed this if I'd known. I believe you, I assured him. I never thought you were part of the deception. But I benefited from it, he said, the realization seeming to hit him with physical force. My wedding, the venue, the flowers, the honeymoon. It was all paid for with money that should have gone to your education. Money Dad specifically set aside for you. Not just the wedding, I added gently. The kitchen renovation, the new furniture, Mom's country club membership. There's been a lot of spending since Dad died that doesn't align with our previous lifestyle. Nathan stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot below. And Uncle Greg? You're sure he was involved with the forged documents? The university traced the submission to Fairview, and his reaction when confronted was telling. He didn't deny it so much as justify it. My brother's shoulders tensed visibly. He's been advising me too, about my career path, about the kind of position I should look for after graduation. He keeps talking about joining his insurance firm, about how the Winters connections could help expand their client base. This was new information, and it added another dimension to Uncle Greg's apparent eagerness to ingratiate himself with the Winters family. That sounds like him trying to benefit from your marriage, I observed. It's more than that, Nathan said, turning back to face me. I think he's been manipulating all of us. Mom, me, even Vanessa's parents, positioning himself as some kind of financial savior while actually undermining Dad's plans for our future. I raised an eyebrow, surprised by Nathan's insight. He had always been emotionally intelligent but rarely analytical about people's motives in this way. What? He asked, noticing my expression. You think I can't see manipulation because I'm usually the one doing the charming? That drew an unexpected laugh from me. Something like that. He sat back down beside me, his expression serious again. So what happens now? You mentioned a resolution document? I showed him the proposed resolution I'd presented to our mother and Uncle Greg, explaining the terms I'd outlined. No legal action regarding the forged documents provided the medical school trust remained untouched, transparent discussion. As a family, and a gradual repayment plan to establish a scholarship in our father's name. I don't know if they'll agree, I admitted. I gave them a week to respond, but I'm not optimistic that Uncle Greg will sign on to anything that admits wrongdoing. Nathan studied the document, then looked up with an expression of determination I'd never seen on his usually carefree face. They'll agree, he said firmly. I'll make sure of it. How? I asked skeptically. The Winters family isn't just wealthy, Liv. They're connected. Mr. Winters sits on the board of 3 major financial institutions. His brother-in-law is the state attorney general. And more importantly, from Uncle Greg's perspective, they control a significant portion of the high-net-worth insurance market in New England. A cold smile spread across Nathan's face. If Uncle Greg wants any kind of relationship with that market, which I know for a fact he does, he'll sign whatever we put in front of him. I stared at my brother, seeing him in an entirely new light. The charming, somewhat frivolous younger sibling had transformed before my eyes into someone calculating and strategic. It was slightly unnerving, but also oddly reassuring. You'd leverage your in-laws against him? I asked. In a heartbeat, Nathan confirmed without hesitation. Vanessa already knows everything. I called her last night after we talked. She's furious on your behalf and has promised her father's full support in resolving this appropriately. The Winters take family loyalty very seriously, just not in the twisted way Uncle Greg defines it. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions, gratitude for this unexpected alliance, concern about involving Vanessa's family in our private affairs, and a strange pride in seeing Nathan step up with such conviction. What about Mom? I asked, voicing my primary concern. I don't want to destroy her reputation or her relationship with you. Nathan's expression softened. Mom made terrible choices, but I think she was being influenced heavily by Uncle Greg. She's always been susceptible to strong personalities. That's how Dad won her over in the first place. He smiled sadly at the memory. We'll hold her accountable, but compassionately. Make her understand what she did wrong without destroying her in the process. I nodded, relieved that we were aligned on this point. So what's the plan? First, we meet with Mom together. No Uncle Greg. We give her the chance to explain herself fully and to commit to the resolution without his interference. Nathan counted off the steps on his fingers. Second, we meet with Uncle Greg. with or without Mom depending on how the first conversation goes. We present a united front and make it clear that his options are severely limited. And if he refuses? Then I make a call to Mr. Winters, who makes a call to the State Banking Commission about potential financial improprieties involving forged documents and misappropriated educational trusts. Nathan's expression was grim. Uncle Greg's insurance business would not survive that kind of scrutiny. The methodical approach reminded me so much of our father that I felt a lump forming in my throat. "When did you become so strategic?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "I've always been strategic about things that matter," he replied with a small smile. "I just didn't always recognize what truly mattered." We spent the rest of the afternoon refining our approach, adjusting the resolution document to include Nathan's active participation in the repayment plan, and preparing for various scenarios that might unfold in our conversations with our mother and uncle. By evening, we had a comprehensive strategy that balanced accountability with compassion, consequences with opportunity for redemption. As we wrapped up our planning session, Nathan looked at me with an expression of genuine admiration. "You know, I always envied how proudly Dad talked about you, his brilliant daughter following in his footsteps. I felt like I could never measure up to that standard." "That's ridiculous," I said. "Dad was incredibly proud of you too, just for different reasons." "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but I see now what he saw in you. Not just intelligence, but integrity. You could have just written off the family after discovering what happened, focused solely on your own path forward. Instead, you tried to create a solution that honors Dad's values while still giving Mom and Uncle Greg a chance to make things right." I felt a warmth spreading through my chest at his words. For years, I had viewed Nathan as my charming but somewhat superficial younger brother. Now I was seeing depths I hadn't recognized. A commitment to family loyalty balanced with clear moral boundaries, emotional intelligence paired with strategic thinking. "We're both our father's children," I said finally, "just in different ways." As I boarded the train back to Baltimore the next day, having agreed to meet Nathan at our mother's house the following weekend for our planned conversation, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my father's death: hope for our family's future. Not as the perfectly aligned unit it had once been, but as something new, more complex, more conscious of its flaws, but potentially stronger for having confronted them. The university documents that had revealed the depth of the betrayal had also, unexpectedly, created the opportunity for something valuable: honesty between siblings who had always operated in separate spheres, a chance for my mother to recognize and atone for her mistakes, and the potential for our family to rebuild around authentic values rather than appearances. The path forward wouldn't be easy or straightforward. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend without effort and time. But as the train pulled away from Hartford, carrying me back to the life I was building for myself, I felt a growing confidence that we would find our way, not back to what we had been, but forward to something worth becoming. The following weekend arrived with remarkable speed. Between my lab responsibilities, clinic hours, and preparation for the upcoming semester, I barely had time to process the emotional weight of the family confrontation that awaited me. My train pulled into Fairview Station precisely at noon on Saturday, where Nathan was waiting with his car, not the luxury vehicle he'd driven throughout college, but a modest sedan I didn't recognize. "Borrowed it from a friend," he explained, noticing my questioning glance as he loaded my overnight bag into the trunk. "Returned the BMW to the dealership yesterday." "Why?" I asked, buckling my seatbelt. "It was leased under Uncle Greg's business." "Account," Nathan replied, pulling away from the station. Part of his generous support of his nephew's image. "I'm not accepting any more financial entanglements with him, regardless of how today goes." This small but significant gesture impressed me. Nathan had always enjoyed the trappings of wealth: designer clothes, expensive cars, exclusive clubs. Voluntarily giving up those perks represented a major shift in priorities. "Have you spoken to Mom?" I asked as we drove through town. "Briefly. She knows we're coming and why. I told her we wanted to have lunch as a family before discussing everything." He glanced at me. She sounded nervous but resigned. I think she knows there's no avoiding this conversation anymore. When we arrived at the house, I immediately noticed the absence of the landscaping trucks and workers that had been present during my previous visit. The half-completed water feature stood abandoned in the front yard, its stone elements scattered across upturned soil. My mother greeted us at the door with the artificial brightness that had become her default in stressful situations. "Nathan! Olivia! I've prepared lunch on the patio. It's such a beautiful day. I thought we might enjoy eating outside." We followed her through the house to the back patio, where a simple meal had been laid out: sandwiches, a fruit platter, and iced tea. No elaborate spread, no attempt at impressive entertaining, just a mother preparing lunch for her children. This, too, felt like a significant shift. Conversation during the meal remained superficial. Comments about the weather, questions about my research, brief mentions of Nathan's abbreviated honeymoon. My mother carefully avoided any references to Vanessa or the Winters family, focusing instead on neutral topics that wouldn't trigger our planned discussion before she was ready. Finally, as we finished eating, she set down her napkin with deliberate care. "I suppose we should move to the living room for our talk. I've asked Greg not to join us today. I thought it might be better if we spoke as just our immediate family first." Nathan and I exchanged surprised glances. We had expected to face both my mother and Uncle Greg, had prepared our approach accordingly. This change suggested my mother might be more willing to engage honestly than we had anticipated. Once settled in the living room, Nathan and I on the sofa, my mother in an armchair across from us, the carefully maintained facade began to crumble. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Before you say anything," she began, her voice uncharacteristically subdued, "I want you both to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking since Olivia's visit last weekend, and I realize that I've made some terrible mistakes." Nathan leaned forward. "Mom," she held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me get this out. It's important." She took a deep breath, seemingly steadying herself. "When your father died, I was completely lost. Not just emotionally, but practically. Robert handled all our finances, made all the major decisions. I had no idea how to navigate any of that on my own. Dad would have had systems in place," I said gently. "He was meticulous about documentation." "He did," she acknowledged. "There were files, accounts, everything clearly labeled, but I was too overwhelmed to deal with it directly. So I turned to Greg. He was family, he was in finance. He seemed like the logical person to help me sort everything out." "And he took advantage of that," Nathan said, his tone harder than I'd expected. My mother's gaze dropped to her hands. "At first, he was genuinely helpful. He explained the life insurance policy, helped with bill payments, made sure the mortgage was covered. But then things started changing. He began talking about repositioning assets and maximizing family opportunities. It all sounded so reasonable the way he explained it." "When did he first suggest using my college fund?" I asked. "It wasn't presented that way initially," she replied, looking up with tears forming in her eyes. "He talked about temporary reallocation of family resources to support Nathan's future. He kept emphasizing how important the Winters connection would be for all of us, how a proper wedding would cement that relationship. He made it sound like an investment, not a theft." "And the forged documents?" I pressed. "The attempt to access the medical school trust?" A tear slipped down her cheek. "That was entirely Greg's doing. He told me he was filing routine paperwork to update your financial aid information. I signed what he put in front of me without reading it carefully. I never would have knowingly agreed to forging your signature, Olivia. Never. I wanted to believe her. The mother I had grown up with, distracted sometimes, occasionally prioritizing Nathan's more immediate needs over my self-sufficiency, but fundamentally loving and honest, would never have deliberately participated in fraud. "Why didn't you tell me what was happening?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months finally escaping. Why keep it secret if it was just a temporary reallocation? Because deep down, I knew it was wrong, she admitted, more tears flowing now, and I was ashamed. Ashamed that I couldn't provide for both of you the way your father had planned. Ashamed that I was prioritizing appearances over substance. Ashamed that I was betraying Robert's careful planning. Her honesty, painful as it was to hear, created an opening for real conversation rather than the confrontation we had anticipated. Nathan reached over and took my hand, a silent signal that we should adjust our approach. "Mom," he said, his voice gentler now, "I need you to know that I would never have wanted my wedding funded at Olivia's expense. If you had told me where the money was coming from, I would have insisted on something simpler, something within our actual means." "I know that now," she said, wiping her eyes. "But at the time, I was so caught up in what the Winters would think, in making sure they didn't see us as beneath them." Greg kept reinforcing that worry, telling me how important first impressions would be for your future business connections. I pulled the resolution document from my bag, but didn't immediately hand it to her. "We've prepared something that outlines how we think we should move forward as a family. But before we get to that, I need to understand exactly what's happening with our finances now. Are there other issues we should know about?" My mother took a shaky breath. "After your visit last week, I insisted that Greg provide me with a complete accounting of everything. It's not good, Olivia. The life insurance money is mostly gone, spent on the wedding, home renovations, and some investments Greg made that haven't performed well. The house still has a mortgage, though it's manageable with my income if I'm more careful with spending." "What about Dad's retirement accounts?" I asked. "His hospital pension?" "Those are intact," she assured me. Greg couldn't access those without going through probate court proceedings, which would have required notifications to all beneficiaries. Small mercies, I thought. At least Uncle Greg's financial manipulation had limits. "And what about Uncle Greg?" Nathan asked. "Where do things stand with him now?" "I told him I wanted to handle this conversation with you both privately," she replied. "He wasn't happy about it. He kept insisting that we needed to present a united family front. But I realized that's been part of the problem all along, this artificial unity that covered up serious problems instead of addressing them." She looked directly at me, her expression more genuine than I'd seen in years. "I've also told him I won't be signing any more financial documents without having them reviewed independently first, and I've scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor Dr. Chen recommended, someone completely separate from Greg's circles." These were small but significant steps, indications that my mother was beginning to reclaim her agency from Uncle Greg's influence. I glanced at Nathan, who gave a slight nod, before handing the resolution document to our mother. "We've outlined a path forward," I explained as she began reading. "It acknowledges what happened without demanding immediate financial restitution that might not be possible. It protects what remains of Dad's provisions for our education, and it creates a schedule for eventually establishing a scholarship in Dad's name with repayments over time." My mother read through the document carefully, occasionally wiping away tears. When she finished, she looked up with a mixture of relief and resignation. "This is more generous than I deserve," she said quietly. "Especially the part about not pursuing legal action regarding the forged documents." "We're not interested in punishing you, Mom," Nathan said. We want accountability and protection against further financial manipulation, not retribution. What about Greg? She asked. This requires his signature as well. He'll sign it, Nathan said with confidence. I've already spoken with Mr. Winters about the situation. If Uncle Greg wants any kind of professional relationship with Winters Insurance Partners going forward, he'll agree to these terms without argument. My mother's eyes widened slightly. You told Harrison Winters about all of this? Not all the details, Nathan clarified. Just enough for him to understand that there had been financial impropriety involving educational trusts that needed to be rectified. He was actually very understanding, said families often have complicated financial dynamics after a loss. I watched my mother process this information, expecting defensiveness or perhaps anger that Nathan had involved his in-laws in our family matters. Instead, she nodded slowly. Your father would be proud of how you're handling this, she said, surprising us both. Standing firm on principles while offering a path to reconciliation. That was very much his approach to conflicts. She picked up a pen from the coffee table and signed the document without further hesitation. I'll make this right somehow, she promised, handing it back to me. Not just the financial part, but the trust that's been broken. I know that will take much longer to repair. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. My mother looked momentarily panicked. That's probably Greg. I told him to come by at 3 to discuss some insurance paperwork. I didn't realize our conversation would reach this point so quickly. Perfect timing, actually, Nathan said, standing up. We can get his signature right now and have this resolved before dinner. The conversation with Uncle Greg was considerably less emotional and more transactional. His initial bluster about family loyalty and strategic financial management faded quickly when Nathan casually mentioned his father-in-law's interest in ensuring that our family's financial matters were resolved appropriately. Harrison Winters is aware of this situation? Uncle Greg asked, his confident facade visibly cracking. He's been very supportive of our efforts to reconcile while establishing proper financial boundaries, Nathan confirmed, not directly answering the question, but allowing Uncle Greg to draw his own conclusions about how much Mr. Winters knew. The implied threat was enough. Uncle Greg signed the resolution with minimal further objection, though his tight smile and clipped responses made his resentment clear. He left shortly afterward, declining my mother's half-hearted invitation to stay for dinner. As the front door closed behind him, an almost tangible weight seemed to lift from the house. My mother's shoulders relaxed, and Nathan let out a low whistle. That was easier than expected, he commented. Only because you leveraged the Winters connection, I pointed out. Without that, I doubt he would have capitulated so quickly. Using available resources effectively is just good strategy, Nathan replied with a hint of his old grin. Dad would have called it appropriate application of leverage. The three of us prepared dinner together that evening, a simple pasta dish my father had loved, with a salad from vegetables grown in our neighbor's garden. The conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years, touching on my research, Nathan's business ideas independent of Uncle Greg's insurance firm, and even tentative plans for the upcoming holidays. As we cleared the dishes afterward, my mother gently touched my arm. I've been thinking about your housing situation in Baltimore, she said. The guest bathroom renovation has been canceled, and I've already given notice at the country club. I can send you that money for a better apartment closer to campus. It's not much compared to what was taken, but it's a start. The gesture, while small in comparison to the overall financial impact, represented something significant. My mother actively choosing to prioritize my needs over appearances and social status. It was the beginning of a realignment with the values my father had embodied. Thank you, I said simply. That would help a lot. Later that night, as Nathan and I sat on the back porch watching fireflies illuminate the summer darkness, he voiced the question that had been lingering in my mind as well. Do you think we can actually move forward from this? As a family, I mean. I considered the day's events. My mother's genuine remorse, Uncle Greg's reluctant compliance, our shared meal and conversations free from pretense. I think we've made a start, I said finally. Not by forgetting what happened, but by acknowledging it honestly and creating boundaries that everyone understands. It won't be the same as before, he observed. No, I agreed. But maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe we needed to move beyond the family dynamics that allowed this situation to develop in the first place. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. Dad always said that the most important thing about making a mistake is what you learn from it. I think we're all learning some important lessons from this one. As I returned to Baltimore the following day, I carried not just the signed resolution document, but also a clearer understanding of my own resilience. The financial betrayal had forced me to develop independence and self-advocacy skills that might otherwise have remained dormant. The confrontation had revealed strengths in Nathan I hadn't previously recognized. Even my mother's belated honesty suggested capacity for growth and change that offered hope for our future relationship. The university documents that had exposed the deception had indeed changed everything, not by magically restoring what was taken, but by creating the opportunity for something potentially more valuable. Authentic relationships built on truth rather than appearances, shared values rather than superficial harmony, and respect for each family member's individual path rather than conformity to external expectations. My father's financial legacy had been partially dismantled, but his true legacy, the values he had instilled in his children, remained intact and had ultimately prevailed. That, I realized, as I watched the Connecticut landscape give way to Maryland through the train window, was worth far more than any college fund. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.